So we're going to be looking very closely at the key elements of AfCFTA national strategies, and I'd like to encourage you to not limit yourself to the PowerPoint nor to the module, but to look at the ARIA 9 report of ECA to be able to better understand what the components are, the brief description and key elements for each component, because when we're talking about gender mainstreaming, we will be mainstreaming gender through these components. So I urge you to look at what the key elements of AfCFTA national strategies as proposed in the ARIA 9 report could be. So if we look at the first slide, you have the macroeconomic framework, production systems and trade patterns review. There's the AfCFTA situational analysis, AfCFTA related risks and mitigation actions review, the identification and prioritization of production and trade opportunities, the identification of constraints to overcome and strategic actions, the strategic objectives, action plan, monitoring and evaluation framework, the financing of AfCFTA implementation, and the communication and visibility plan. Now, when we talk about operationalizing gender mainstreaming in AfCFTA national strategies, and we apply the gender analysis, we're looking particularly about applying a gender analysis to the key elements of AfCFTA national strategies. But first of all, just to understand at a high level, what is gender analysis and why is it important? Well, very quickly, gender analysis is important because it helps us to better understand the challenges that the AfCFTA could create, again, for women who tend to be disproportionately affected by the deeply rooted gender inequalities and structural barriers to economic empowerment. And it's really important for gender analysis to be undertaken because it helps to provide clarity on the gender inclusion and AfCFTA linkages, and also to identify potential mechanisms where AfCFTA implementation can impact on gender inequalities, either positively or negatively. Now, this process really is important, and it's critical that it's not a technical checkbox exercise, but it is rather an integral lens that contextualizes, that molds and shapes interventions towards the design of these gender-sensitive AfCFTA policies. Now, when and what does gender analysis entail? Well, it's, as I said, it's a practical tool to understand the differences between women and men regarding specific activities, conditions, needs, access to, and control over resources. And it's really a systematic way of examining the relationship between women and men and identifying who does what, who has what influences arrangements relating to resources, access, and control. I'm not going to go through what gender analysis supports, but there are a few issues that gender analysis supports a better understanding of. And I encourage you to look at your modules in respect of what those are. Now, central to gender analysis is gender and trade data. And this is particularly, gender and trade data is particularly critical for gender analysis. Now, solid gender analysis depends on the availability of reliable and relevant data and statistics on gender and trade. That is vital to understanding prevailing gender inequalities and structural barriers in the economy. But as we know, that the collection of gender disaggregated data, of sex disaggregated data is not usually collected in most African countries, and there are challenges with regard to this. But data is so important because we know that the current statistics make it clear that women are at a disadvantage when it comes to engaging in regional and in international trade. But why? Why is this so? What are the barriers to trade participation? What are these gender-specific obstacles? What are the structural differences in the economic participation of women and men in these different sectors, in agriculture, in manufacturing, in services, that contribute to women's underrepresentation in regional and global trade? So getting the data is so important for us to be able to understand and to break down what these inequalities are that are confronting women as workers, as entrepreneurs, as producers, as informal cross-border traders. It's critical for us to be able to understand the data. But as I said, and as you know, data is a challenge. Gender and trade data for gender analysis is a challenge for our countries. So given the limited gender and trade data, we require to look more closely at a specific gender diagnostic. Now, this is going to require looking at data from a variety of sources and a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, because a combination of both methods can be effective in helping to provide a full picture and identifying and responding to critical questions that will inform our gender responsive policies and complementary measures and other targeted interventions that we are working towards identifying in the context of the AfCFTA. Now, when you look at quantitative data sources, these include labor force surveys, population census, household surveys, Federation of Employer surveys, impact evaluation surveys, enterprise surveys, development plans, research studies, including annual economic reports of ministries of commerce, finance, economic development. When we look at qualitative data methods, these will include primary surveys and consultations, unstructured or semi-structured interviews, and community and social mapping. We also have secondary data sources from government reports and research studies, including country-specific investment, climate, or value chain studies that could be particularly useful to compare and to cross-check information from more localized primary data collection. And of course, these consultations are so important because they help to provide valuable qualitative data in relation to the critical needs of women or men who may be particularly disadvantaged, and in so doing provides a useful tool for developing proactive measures that respond to identified needs and priorities. Now, it's important. It's so important for me to stress and to underscore the fact that stakeholder consultations must be with both women and men. It must consider the views of both women and men. And when we talk about gender, we're not talking about gender being a woman's only issue. So when these stakeholder consultations are convened, they must be held, the discussions, the consultations must consider the views, perspectives of both women and men. And of course, as I said, if trade and gender statistics are not available, surveys are critically important, and they may be developed to collect data on different aspects of women and men's participation in trade as workers, as producers, as traders, and to compile this data on detailed product groups that are exported and or imported by corresponding firms. And you will see going forward, both in the course modules and as you contribute to developing your country's AfCFTA national strategies, that these surveys are going to be particularly important in terms of asking the right questions and getting the right information that will eventually inform the kind of gender responsive, proactive policies and complementary measures to enhance and to ensure equal opportunities for men and women in the AfCFTA. And of course, key consultations that we are talking about and key stakeholders as part of gender analysis that should be consulted are the private sector, including chambers of commerce, export councils, regional and national women's business associations, civil society, including national or regional cross-border trade organizations, agricultural producer, farmers associations, women's research networks, grassroots organizations, small-scale traders, entrepreneurs from the formal and informal sector with different size enterprises, labor organizations, trade unions, universities, other academic think tanks and research institutions, and of course, representatives of key ministries, including trade, industry, economic development, and representatives from ministries of gender, finance, agriculture, and education, but some of the important stakeholders. And I'd like you to, I may have missed other key stakeholders, and I would like you to also contribute to who those key stakeholders may be in the context of your country. Now, it's critically important to ask the right questions as part of gender analysis. So what are the gender responsive guiding questions that should be asked? How should this data be collected? Well, data is collected and should be driven by gender responsive guiding questions that really map out the key gender dimension in priority economic sectors. And these questions can help to organize data and collect information, to structure consultations with stakeholders, again, both men and women. And it's important that these questions are formulated as part of gender analysis and that they take into consideration prevailing gender inequalities, which lie in the dimension and access to and control over assets, labor remuneration, and human capital. And it's important, gender analysis is particularly important because it is this gender analysis that identifies gender-specific constraints that encompass both measurable inequalities that are revealed by sex disaggregated data. And it's this gender analysis that informs a gender assessment, that presents context-specific information, and that sheds light on gender-specific issues and what the systematic causes of inequalities are. And the findings from a gender assessment informs our ultimate goal of gender-responsive policies and complementary measures that bring about gender equitable outcomes in AfCFTA implementation. Now, what are when we look at understanding gender inclusion and AfCFTA linkages, before we start drilling deeper, I just want us to be able to understand at a high level, again, a prerequisite for gender sensitive design or gender responsive design of AfCFTA policies and complementary measures is really fundamentally to understand the gender inclusion and AfCFTA linkages. And again, how do we achieve this? Well, we do this through gender analysis. And as I mentioned, there's no prescribed approach, but there are certain recommended steps. And this includes the identification of entry points for the application of gender analysis to key components of AfCFTA national strategies. Now, before we look at what these entry points could be, these are proposed entry points. But again, I'd like you to understand it and to contextualize it in your country context, in your domestic realities. And as I talk through what potential entry points could be, think about how you can build on that. What may not work, what are fundamental, what are essential to have as a first port of call, but don't necessarily limit yourself to what those entry points could be. This is your national strategy. This is your approach to gender mainstreaming. So you decide. I have proposed a few entry points, but by no means should you be limited in your approach to the identification of what these entry points may be. So, identification of gender analysis entry points. I propose developing a detailed gender picture of the economy, understanding the gender characteristics of production and trade opportunities and constraints, creating opportunities for stakeholder engagement for gender analysis. Now, when we look at developing a detailed gender picture of the economy, there's certain fundamentals, I think, that will need to be considered. But as I said, don't limit yourself to that. And it's important to clarify that the entry points for the application of gender analysis are have been identified in relation and are being applied in relation to the key elements of the AfCFTA national strategies that we looked at earlier on. And that includes the macroeconomic framework, the AfCFTA situational analysis, AfCFTA related risks and mitigation actions, prioritization of production and trade opportunities. We are applying the entry points to the key elements of AfCFTA national strategies that have been identified in the Area 9 publication and included in your course module. And it's really that framework that guided the approach to the development of AfCFTA national strategies for last year. For 2019, ECA supported over 15 countries across the continent in developing these national strategies, and the framework that was used was the one that has been identified in the Area 9 report and that we are looking at today, and applying the approach to gender mainstreaming and the gender analysis entry points to that particular framework. So it's important for us to first understand and to get an idea of what the gendered picture of the economy is. And to be able to do that, we need to recognize the gender dynamics for various subgroups of women in the economy and understand how women participate in trade, specifically as producers, workers, entrepreneurs, formal and informal enterprise, small scale and informal cross-border traders, recognizing the gender differentials in instruments of economic empowerment that may limit women's ability to respond to trade opportunities, such as access to and control over productive resources and key inputs, including land and financial resources, market information, digital technology, time spent by men and women on unpaid care work, analyzing the economic ramifications of COVID-19 and understanding whether the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women and men's economic lives. It's also important to understand the following, in which sectors gender inequalities are likely to deepen in the wake of COVID-19. What has the impact of the pandemic been on border closures and restrictions on the economic activity of informal cross-border traders and other hard-hit sectors, including tourism, hospitality, retail, agriculture, and agri and horticulture, textiles, and garment industries? And what about the digital gender divide that we learned about in Module 2? Is COVID-19 placing women at a particular disadvantage? And thinking again about the mobile connectivity required for women to leverage digital tools. So it's important for us to understand what this gender picture of the economy could entail. And then it's important to understand, as part of the entry points for the application of gender analysis to key elements of AfCFTA national strategies, it's important to understand gender characteristics of production and trade opportunities and constraints, to look at export expansion and import displacement arising from AfCFTA implementation on different sectors where women are economically active, and the consequent impact, potential impact on women, to look at specific products and sectors that may be particularly vulnerable for intra-African trade liberalization. And we think here again of products and sectors that are critical for food security, that employ a high number of women and are considered essential for women's needs. We also need to identify and to examine more closely the priority economic sectors where women are concentrated, including in agriculture and in services, but also looking, of course, at manufacturing that's expected and will be that's at the crux of the AfCFTA, and where new trade opportunities are expected to arise. And within that, to examine gender-specific constraints confronting women in their roles as producers, as workers, as entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses, and formal and informal enterprises, examination of gender-specific constraints confronting women informal cross-border traders, identification of new trade and economic opportunities to catalyze women's entrepreneurship and empowerment, identification of promising export markets, of non-traditional sectors that we looked at in Module 2. And what about those products with high export potential, of regional value chains with positive socioeconomic impact, specifically in terms of the creation of productive employment and decent jobs. And then we need to look at and to understand the fact that gender analysis really creates the opportunity for stakeholder engagement. It really provides us with the opportunity to consult with and integrate a range of voices as part of the data collection process. And again, given the limited data on gender and trade in most African countries, we did speak about using data from a variety of sources that combines qualitative and quantitative methods. And again, consultations are critical because they provide these valuable insights. And we spoke a little bit about who these key stakeholders might be.